Welcome to your personalized deep dive. You sent over some fascinating material for us to go through, all centered around this conversation with AI researcher Alexander Naumenko.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into his thoughts on intelligence and language and how something as simple as the game 20 questions can give us some pretty profound insights into how our minds work.
It's really interesting how he kind of immediately dismantles some common assumptions about intelligence right from the start.
Yeah.
He argues against this idea of atomic concepts, the idea that concepts exist in isolation.
hmm
Instead, he really emphasizes the relationships between concepts.
Yeah.
And he illustrates this with, I think, a pretty simple example. He talks about, how differently we relate apples to peaches versus spoons or galaxies or even something abstract like democracy.
Right. It's not just about whether things are similar or different, but the degree of difference, right?
Exactly. And this leads him to kind of a critique of prototype theory, which is the idea that we categorize things based on this perfect example in our heads.
Right.
And he argues that that wouldn't work in real time.
Yeah.
Imagine your brain frantically comparing an apple to every other concept to, before you could decide what it is.
Our brains are way too fast for that.
Right.
We categorize things almost effortlessly, so there's got to be a more efficient system at play.
Right. So he suggests focusing on differences rather than similarities when categorizing. And he gives this example of a child who sees a cow for the first time and calls it a pig with horns.
Right.
And the child is picking up on these key differences to make sense of this creature that they've never seen before.
Yeah, it highlights how we really build understanding by focusing on what sets things apart, not just on what they share in common.
Yeah.
And this seems like a perfect segue to the 20 questions game, which he uses as a model for understanding intelligence.
That's a great observation. Yeah, he argues that the power of 20 questions is in its efficiency.
Right.
With just 20 well-chosen yes-no questions, using something called semantic binary search,
Right.
you can distinguish between a million different concepts.
That's incredible. And it makes you think about the limitations of current AI, right?
Yeah.
Where it often requires mountains of data to differentiate between just a handful of concepts. And here's this simple game based on targeted comparisons that seems to outperform AI by a huge margin.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective. And Alexander argues that at its core, intelligence is about elimination.
Right.
About efficiently selecting the best option from the available possibilities given certain constraints.
So intelligence isn't just about knowing a lot of stuff. It's about knowing which questions to ask to quickly filter through information or make decisions.
Exactly. And this brings us to how he kind of rethinks generalization.
Okay.
He views it as a process of strategically forgetting differences. So, for example, when we see a green chair, a blue chair, a red chair,
Right.
we kind of forget the color differences to arrive at the concept of chair.
He uses the example of tea as well. Green tea, black tea, herbal tea.
Right.
We forget those specifics to understand that the core concept of tea is a beverage made by steeping leaves in hot water.
Precisely. By strategically forgetting those less relevant differences, we arise at these broader, more useful categories.
Right.
And this process of generalization is super crucial for real-time decision-making, which is another key element of intelligence. And Alexander uses this example of a tennis match.
Okay.
Even the top players in the world can't predict the outcome of every single point,
Right.
but they still have to, make these decisions based on their understanding of the game.
Yeah. They're constantly evaluating the situation, considering their available options, taking action based on the constraints of that moment.
Exactly. And it's not about perfectly predicting the future, but just making choices that move you towards your desired outcome. He uses this great analogy. No rational tennis player would ever intentionally miss a shot just because they thought they would.
So it's more about responding effectively to this dynamic situation, this
Yeah.
back and forth, than it is trying to perfectly predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the concept of causality.
Yes. Alexander, he challenges this traditional kind of religious explanation of causality as simply God's will, which, doesn't really offer a lot of practical insight.
Yeah.
He stresses the importance of reliable recipes, of understanding the link between actions and outcomes.
So it's like in cooking, even if you have a really good recipe,
Yeah,
the outcome's not always guaranteed.
right.
But, understanding the steps increases your chances of success.
That's a great analogy. And this leads to his kind of core algorithm of intelligence, which is, and I'm going to quote here, selection of the most fitting option from the available ones, given the relevant constraints.
It's such a simple idea, but so powerful. It's like reframing intelligence as this elegant process of filtering and selection.
Absolutely. He demonstrates how this algorithm can be applied to a wide range of situations, from something as basic as like object recognition to something as complex as solving a detective mystery.
So in object recognition, the available options would be all the categories we know, and the constraints would be the properties of the object we're looking at, right?
Exactly. And in a detective mystery, the options are the suspects and the constraints are the clues
Right.
that help us kind of eliminate possibilities.
It's amazing how this simple framework can be applied across such different domains.
It really highlights the kind of unifying power of his ideas. Now, here's where things get really interesting. If intelligence is about selecting from existing options,
Right.
where does that leave creativity?
That's a great question. It seems counterintuitive to think about creativity as a form of selection.
He argues that what we often perceive as creativity is actually the result of like training and experience.
Okay.
So, like someone who knows a dozen dance moves
Right.
will appear more creative than someone who only knows one.
Right.
It's a matter of having more options to choose from.
So it's not that the person with more moves is like inherently more creative, but their knowledge and experience give them more options to draw from.
Precisely. And this kind of leads to another important distinction: intelligence versus learning.
Right.
Learning is about acquiring those new options, new recipes, new ways of understanding the world.
So learning expands our pool of options, while intelligence is about making smart choices from those options in real time.
Exactly. And this sets the stage for his fascinating take on the role of language in intelligence.
This is where things tend to get really complicated with a lot of traditional AI theories, right?
Well, get ready for a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander argues that language doesn't directly communicate information. Instead, it acts as a guide for our attention,
Okay.
directing us to information that's already present in our minds or in the world around us.
So language is more like a pointer, a finger pointing you towards something you already know rather than like a data transmission cable.
Perfect analogy. Imagine I say, look at that red bird.
Right.
I'm not transmitting all the information about what a red bird is. I'm just directing your attention.
Right.
And your visual system, which is much more powerful than language when it comes to processing visual information, takes over from there.
But what about things we can't directly see? Like abstract concepts or events that happened in the past.
That's where memory and imagination come in.
Okay.
When we talk about the past, we're using language to like direct each other's attention to specific memories.
So we're pointing to internal representations rather than physical objects in the world.
Exactly. And when we discuss, hypothetical scenarios or imaginary worlds, language is guiding our imaginations.
So language is like this universal remote control for our minds, right?
Mm.
Able to access information from our senses, our memories, and even our imagination.
That's a great way to put it. And this attention guiding function, it extends to how we use references.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander points out that references are essentially like stacked filters,
Okay.
helping us narrow down the possibilities to like the specific thing we're talking about.
It's like the game of 20 questions again, where each question eliminates a bunch of possibilities, getting you closer to the answer.
Precisely. But like in 20 questions, the effectiveness of a reference depends on context. Saying like red ball in a snooker hall evokes a different image than saying red ball in a toy store.
So a word's meaning isn't fixed, but it depends on the context in which it's used.
Exactly. And this context dependence isn't like a flaw of language, it's a feature.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of how intelligence actually operates in the real world, constantly adapting to the situation.
It makes language more flexible and adaptable, allowing us to communicate in all these different situations effectively. And speaking of adaptability, this makes me think about how negation fits into all of this. Sometimes it's easier to define something by what it's not, rather than what it is.
Absolutely. Think about those dating app profiles that say, no drama, no baggage.
Right.
Negation is just another tool for filtering those options,
Right.
helping us kind of hone in on meaning.
So to recap, what Alexander is saying is that language doesn't transmit information directly,
Right.
but guides our attention to information that's already present, either in our minds or out in the world around us.
Yeah.
And this makes language a powerful tool for sharing knowledge, coordinating actions, and shaping each other's understanding of the world.
You've captured it perfectly. And this attention guiding function is like intricately tied to his core algorithm of intelligence.
Right.
We're constantly selecting, applying constraints, and like arriving at the most fitting interpretation based on context.
Which brings us to the question of meaning. If language doesn't transmit meaning directly, how do we arrive at a shared understanding?
That's an excellent question. Alexander would say that meaning isn't transmitted, but co-created by both the speaker and the listener.
So it's not just about what the speaker is trying to convey,
Mhm.
but also how the listener interprets it based on their own, knowledge and experiences and
So
everything.
nicely. The speaker's using language to guide the listener's attention to a set of options, and then the listener uses their cognitive abilities to select the most fitting interpretation.
Which explains why misunderstandings happen, right?
Yeah.
If the speaker and the listener have different assumptions or are operating in different contexts, they might arrive at different interpretations of the same words.
Absolutely. And this is where the multidimensionality of objects and concepts comes into play.
Hmm.
Any object can be described using various properties.
Right.
And like the choice of which properties to highlight depends on the speaker's goals and the context of the
So
conversation.
there's no single correct description of anything. The meaning we derive from language depends on which aspects of a thing are being highlighted and the context in which they're presented.
Exactly. And this ambiguity inherent in language, it creates these opportunities for both clarity and deception.
This is getting interesting. Tell me more about the deception part.
He uses the example of like police interrogations.
Okay.
A suspect might intentionally mislead the interrogator by highlighting certain details and omitting others to create this like false impression of innocence.
So they're strategically using language to manipulate the interrogator's understanding of what happened.
Precisely. We see this strategic use of language in storytelling as well. Think about how, metaphors and similes and other figures of speech are
Right.
used to evoke emotions, create suspense, engage the listener's imagination.
So language can be used to reveal the truth, but also to conceal it.
Exactly. And this leads to his definition of a lie, which I think really captures this strategic element.
Okay.
He says a lie is a believable misreporting of private context.
Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Sure.
What exactly does he mean by private context?
Private context refers to information that only the speaker knows.
Okay.
So their thoughts, feelings, their experiences.
Right.
For example, if I tell you I was at home last night, you can't directly verify that.
Right. Unless you have hidden cameras in my house.
Right. So if I'm lying about my whereabouts, I'm relying on your inability to access that private context to make that lie believable.
And the believable part is key, right?
Yeah,
If a lie is too outlandish, it's less likely to work.
exactly. So a successful lie requires both that misreporting of private context and a degree of believability.
So it's not just stating something false, but strategically using language to shape someone's understanding of a situation that they can't directly verify.
You've got it. And this kind of brings us to the intersection of language and logic.
Okay.
Alexander argues that traditional logic, with its like focus on these really precise definitions and this idea of absolute truth, isn't really well suited to understanding the nuances of how we communicate as humans.
This reminds me of his point about ranges versus precise measurements.
Hmm.
We often communicate using approximations and generalizations, not exact values.
Exactly. He uses the example of calling his hair black, even though it has, some gray strands in it.
Right.
And a logician might say, well, that's false.
Yeah.
But in everyday language, it's perfectly acceptable.
So good enough is often good enough when it comes to language.
Right. This tolerance for imprecision, it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
It allows us to communicate very efficiently in a world where absolute certainty is often elusive.
This makes me wonder, if traditional logic is too rigid for language, what kind of logic do we need?
That's a great question. Alexander would argue that we need a logic that reflects how humans actually think and reason.
Okay.
A logic that can handle ambiguity, context dependence, and the inherent kind of fuzziness of meaning.
So a logic more in line with his core algorithm of intelligence, where the goal is to select that most fitting option given the constraints of the situation.
Precisely. And this is where his work, I think, gets really exciting. He's kind of offering us this whole new way of thinking about intelligence, language, and the very nature of truth itself, a way that's grounded in real-world experience, not just these, like, abstract theories.
This has been an incredible journey through some pretty profound ideas. I feel like I'm seeing language and intelligence in a whole new light.
It seems like his insights have really resonated with you.
They definitely have. But before we get too carried away, I think we should pause here and give our listeners a chance to absorb everything we've discussed so far. We'll be back soon to continue exploring Alexander's thoughts on AI, consciousness, and what the future might hold for intelligence in general.
Welcome back. We were just discussing the limitations of traditional logic when it comes to understanding language.
Yeah, it feels like that black and white thinking doesn't really capture the nuance and flexibility in how we actually use language.
Alexander makes a really compelling case that pursuing this absolute precision in language can actually be misleading,
Okay.
especially when you're trying to understand something as complex as intelligence.
That seems counterintuitive, though.
Yeah,
Like, don't we want our words to have clear and unambiguous meanings?
right.
Like, isn't precision a good thing?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the classical view, right?
Yeah.
But Alexander argues that even seemingly simple words, like they can have multiple meanings depending on the context.
Sure.
Take the word high, for example.
Right.
Could refer to a physical height, a musical pitch, or even like your blood sugar level.
It's true, yeah. The same word can have completely different meanings depending on how it's used.
Exactly. And the meaning we ascribe to a word like high, it's really determined by the surrounding words and the overall context of the conversation.
So context is everything when it comes to understanding language.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the dictionary definition of a word.
Yeah, and this is where his core algorithm of intelligence comes into play again.
Right.
When we encounter a word that has these multiple meanings, our brains don't get stuck.
Right.
They use the context to kind of quickly filter through the possibilities and select the most fitting interpretation.
So it's almost as if our brains are constantly playing this subconscious game of 20 questions,
Yeah. Yeah.
using contextual clues to eliminate incorrect meanings and zero in on the intended one.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And what's so remarkable is that this process of disambiguation, it's not a conscious act, it's not something we deliberately do.
Right. Yeah.
It's this automatic subconscious function of our intelligence, and it happens so effortlessly that we barely even notice it.
It's amazing how much our brains are doing kind of behind the scenes to make sense of everything, all this information.
Really is. And this kind of brings us to another key aspect of Alexander's theory, which is this idea that language doesn't directly communicate information, but rather acts as this kind of guide for our attention.
Okay.
And what this means is that the meaning we derive from language, it isn't solely determined by like the speaker's intentions.
Right.
It's also influenced by our own like internal state and our understanding of the context.
So it's not as simple as just transferring information like from one mind to another.
Yeah.
It's more like the speaker provides the raw materials and then the listener's brain kind of constructs the meaning based on their own individual experiences and knowledge and all of that.
Exactly. He uses a phrase like high key as an example. It can
Yeah.
have all these different meanings depending on, who's saying it and in what situation.
Yeah.
It could be a high-pitched voice, a very important key, or even just like slang to emphasize something.
So the same words can take on very different meanings depending on how we interpret them.
Right. It's not just about decoding some fixed message.
It seems like Alexander is really skeptical of those traditional approaches to AI that focus so heavily on logic and precision.
Yeah.
It feels like they're missing this fundamental part of what makes human language so powerful and adaptable.
He makes this strong argument that human language, it's messy, it's ambiguous, and it's deeply intertwined with, our emotions, our experiences, our cultural background.
Right.
And to truly understand it, you need a model of intelligence that can embrace that messiness, that
Yeah.
can find meaning within that.
And it seems like his core algorithm of intelligence, with the emphasis on selecting the most fitting option,
Yeah.
based on these constraints.
Yeah.
That's a more promising approach, at least from his perspective.
It certainly aligns well with how he views human intelligence.
Yeah.
And this kind of brings us to the question of truth. If meaning is co-created by the speaker and the listener, and language is inherently ambiguous, what does that mean for the concept of truth itself?
Yeah, now that's a big question.
Yeah,
We're getting into some deep philosophical territory here.
we are. But Alexander, he tackles these questions head on.
Okay.
He suggests that we need to move beyond this traditional view of truth as something that is, absolute and objective,
Right.
independent of context or interpretation. He argues that truth is always partial, relative, and dependent on the specific situation.
So are you saying that there's no such thing as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Well, not in that absolute sense, no.
Okay.
He points out that even seemingly straightforward statements can be true in one context and false in another.
Okay.
You remember his example of like saying, "My hair is black even though it has a few gray strands?"
Right. Right. To a logician, that would be considered a false statement.
You're right.
But in everyday conversation, we understand what he means.
Exactly. The truthfulness of a statement depends on the context in which it's made.
Yeah.
And like the shared understanding between the speaker and the listener.
So truth is more about agreement and a shared understanding than some perfect correspondence to objective reality out there.
That's a great way to put it. And this has really profound implications for how we understand communication, knowledge, and even our own beliefs,
Yeah.
you know?
That's making me rethink some of my own assumptions about how the world works. It's like
Yeah.
he's giving us this new lens through which to view reality,
Yeah.
one that embraces complexity and ambiguity rather than shying away from it.
I think that's a great way to describe it. His ideas are definitely challenging,
Yeah.
but they're also incredibly stimulating and thought-provoking.
Okay, I'm ready for the next challenge. What else does he have to say about truth and its relationship to language?
Well, this is where his analysis of lies gets really interesting.
Okay.
You remember, he defines a lie as a believable misreporting of private context.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier, but I admit I'm still a little bit fuzzy on the details there.
Okay, sure.
Can you break that down for me again?
Yeah, so remember that private context refers to information that is only known to the speaker.
Right.
So, my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences,
Right.
all part of my private context. If I tell you something about my private context that is false, and I do so in a way that you believe, then I am telling a lie.
So for something to be a lie, it's not enough for it to be false. It also has to be about something that the listener can't directly verify, right?
Exactly.
Mm,
If I tell you that the sky is green, you can immediately verify that that's false just by, looking up.
right.
But if I tell you that I was thinking about you last night, you have no way to confirm or deny that.
Right, unless you happen to be telepathic.
Right. So lies kind of thrive in this realm of private context where they can't be easily, fact checked.
Right.
And to be effective, lies also have to be believable.
Right.
If I tell you that I flew to the moon last night, you're unlikely to believe me, even though you can't directly verify that either.
It seems like a successful lie requires this careful balance of falsehood and believability.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that Alexander points out that this strategic use of language isn't limited to like outright deception.
Right.
We use it all the time in everyday conversation,
Right.
often without even realizing it,
Yeah.
We choose our words carefully to create a desired impression, to emphasize certain aspects of reality, and to downplay others.
Right.
We're all constantly shaping narratives,
Yeah.
whether we intend to or not.
So language isn't just about conveying neutral information. It's this powerful tool for persuasion and influence and even self-deception.
Exactly. And this highlights how important it is to be aware of the ways in which language can be used to like shape our perceptions and beliefs,
Right.
both by others and by ourselves.
It makes you think about the dangers of propaganda and how it can be used to manipulate people by presenting a distorted view of reality.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Propaganda often relies on lies, half-truths, and this really carefully crafted language to sway public opinion and influence behavior.
It seems like understanding how language works,
Yeah.
how it can be used to both illuminate and obscure the truth
Yeah,
is essential for navigating the complexities of the modern world.
I completely agree. And his insights really provide this valuable framework for developing that understanding, I think.
Right.
He's encouraging us to move beyond these simplistic notions of truth and falsehood and to embrace the inherent ambiguity and complexity of language.
This has been a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But it's been incredibly stimulating.
Yeah.
I'm hearing language in this whole new way now.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Sounds like Alexander's ideas are resonating with you.
They definitely are. But before we journey further down this path, I think we should take a moment to allow our listeners to process everything we've covered so far.
Okay.
We'll be back shortly to explore the implications of his ideas for artificial intelligence, consciousness, and what the future holds for both human and artificial minds. Welcome back to our deep dive into the mind of Alexander Naumenko. We've been exploring his fascinating ideas about intelligence and language, and now it's time to turn our attention to the realm of artificial intelligence.
This is where his ideas get really, I think, challenging and thought-provoking.
Yeah,
Given everything we've talked about so far, with the limitations of logic and this messy, context-dependent nature of language,
right.
I'm really curious to hear his take on AI.
Yeah, me too. It seems like a lot of current AI research is so focused on computational power, you know,
Right.
massive data sets.
Yeah.
But Alexander seems to suggest that true intelligence lies somewhere else.
He definitely does. He argues that intelligence is primarily about selection, not computation.
Hmm.
And this has huge implications for how we think about AI and how we approach it.
So instead of trying to build these machines that can crunch numbers and execute these complex algorithms, we should be focusing on machines that can make decisions in the real world, given a certain set of options and constraints.
Exactly. Alexander believes that a lot of the current AI approaches, especially those focused on things like deep learning and neural networks,
Right.
are kind of fundamentally limited because they lack this semantic understanding, this contextual awareness
Okay.
that is really essential for true intelligence.
This makes me think about his point about neural networks being fooled by those spurious correlations.
Ooh.
He gave that example of the system that learned to diagnose cancer based on markings that were actually just artifacts of the imaging process.
That's a great example. It highlights the danger of relying solely on these statistical methods to build intelligent systems.
Right.
Without a deeper understanding of meaning and how concepts relate to each other, these systems are just prone to making these absurd and potentially dangerous mistakes.
So if deep learning isn't the answer, what does Alexander propose as an alternative?
Well, he advocates for an approach he calls meaningful AI.
Okay.
And this type of AI would be grounded in the same principles of selection and constraint satisfaction that he sees as so fundamental to human intelligence.
Okay.
So it would involve building systems that can understand these relationships between concepts, that can reason about cause and effect and make decisions based on these real world goals and limitations.
So instead of feeding machines just endless amounts of data and hoping they'll magically learn to think like humans,
Okay.
we need to actually design them with this deeper understanding of how human intelligence actually works.
Precisely. Alexander believes that the key to building truly intelligent machines lies in understanding that core algorithm of intelligence. Selecting the most fitting option from a set of possibilities given those relevant constraints.
Yeah, and it seems like his 20 questions analogy is like such a perfect illustration of that process.
Right.
Each question acts as this constraint, narrowing down those possibilities until you arrive at the right answer.
Exactly. And Alexander believes that that same principle can be applied to this whole range of cognitive tasks,
Right.
from recognizing objects, understanding language, to solving these complex problems out in the real world.
This makes me wonder about the importance of embodiment in intelligence. Can a machine truly understand the world if it doesn't have a body that allows it to, interact with the environment, gather that sensory information?
That's a great question, and it's one that Alexander addresses directly.
Okay.
He believes that embodiment is absolutely crucial for developing this really rich understanding of the world.
Hmm.
Our sensory experiences, our interactions with the physical environment, they shape how we understand concepts, how we understand these relationships between things.
So a machine that can only process text or code will never truly grasp like the meaning of a word like red or hot
Hmm.
because it hasn't actually experienced those qualities, those feelings directly,
Right.
you know?
Exactly. Embodiment provides that grounding,
Yeah.
that real world context that allows us to connect those abstract symbols to the physical world.
Yeah, It's like the difference between reading about a place and actually going there.
Right.
No matter how detailed the description is, there's no substitute for that firsthand experience.
Absolutely. And Alexander argues that the same principle applies to AI.
Okay.
To build machines that can genuinely understand the world, we need to give them bodies
Right.
that allow them to experience it directly.
So we need to move beyond these disembodied AI systems like chatbots and virtual assistants
Right.
and start building robots that can walk and talk and interact with the world in a more, human-like way.
Yeah.
Robots that can learn and adapt
Right.
based on those experiences.
That's precisely what he envisions. And this leads us to I think the ultimate question, consciousness.
Right.
Can we build machines that are not only intelligent but also conscious, machines that have these subjective experiences, feelings, a sense of self?
Oh, wow. That's a question that's captivated philosophers and scientists for centuries.
Yeah.
It feels like we're venturing into like science fiction territory here.
Certainly feels that way.
Yeah.
But, these rapid advancements in AI are really making these questions more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, Alexander has some pretty intriguing thoughts on this.
Okay.
He argues that consciousness is what he calls an emergent property of intelligence.
Hmm.
It arises from the way our brains process information, from the way they interact with the world.
So consciousness isn't like this thing that's separate from intelligence, but rather it's a quality that kind of emerges once you reach a certain level of complexity and sophistication in information processing.
Exactly. And he believes that as we develop these more and more sophisticated AI systems, systems that are embodied, that are contextually aware, that are capable of making these decisions based on real world goals and constraints,
Yeah.
we will inevitably create machines that exhibit, at least signs of consciousness.
That's a bold prediction. It's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling to imagine a future where machines might share our capacity
Mhm.
for subjective experience.
It certainly raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions
Yeah.
about the future of humanity and our relationship with intelligent machines. I mean, if we create machines that are as intelligent as we are, or perhaps even more intelligent, how will we coexist with them?
Right?
Will they be our partners? Will they be our rivals? Or will they be something else entirely?
Those are questions that we really need to start grappling with now, before it's too late.
I agree.
And Alexander's work, I think, provides a valuable starting point for that conversation.
Yeah.
By understanding those principles of intelligence and how they relate to language, to consciousness, to even the nature of truth,
Right.
we can start to envision a future where humans and intelligent machines can actually coexist and collaborate in a way that benefits everyone.
Absolutely.
This has been an incredibly stimulating and
Yeah.
challenging deep dive.
Yeah.
Alexander Naumenko's ideas have really pushed me to rethink a lot of my assumptions about intelligence and language and really the nature of reality itself.
It seems like his work has sparked a real intellectual awakening for you.
It definitely has. And I hope our listeners have experienced a similar kind of shift in perspective.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the limits of logic to the power of language, from the future of AI to the mysteries of consciousness.
It's been a real whirlwind tour through that landscape of intelligence, guided by Alexander's, I think, very unique and insightful perspective.
And for one final thought to ponder as you continue your own explorations, if intelligence is truly about selecting from available options, as Alexander suggests,
Right.
where does that leave the concept of free will? Are we truly making choices? Or are we simply following these predetermined paths? Is there something more to our capacity for agency and self-determination? That's something for you to reflect on, to explore further as you delve deeper into the mysteries of the mind.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.